The Italian Wine Podcast is the community-driven platform for Italian wine geeks around the world. Support the show by donating at ItalianWinepodcast.com. Donate €5 or more and we'll send you a copy of our latest book, My Italian Grape Geek Journal, absolutely free. To get your free copy of My Italian Grape Geek Journal, click Support Us at ItalianWinepodcast.com or wherever you get your pods. Grazie mille. Welcome to the Italian Grape Geek podcast. Join us as we explore personal stories of travel and tasting with Italy's must-know grape varietals. Chart your own course with My Italian Grape Geek Journal, your personal tasting companion to accompany the series. Available now on Amazon. With thanks to Colangelo and Partners for their generous support with this project.
Welcome back, bentornati. Now we're moving on to Lambrusco. So traditionally, Lambrusco is a brightly colored grape variety used to make sparkling red wines in Emilia-Romagna. The first record of cultivation dates back to the 10th century, but today Lambrusco is synonymous with a variety of fruity, light-hearted sparkling reds throughout central northern Italy from a wide range of varieties. So again, as we had talked about Colorino and then Greco, we're dealing with a family of Lambrusco grapes. What's interesting to note in comparison to Colorino and Greco is that with Lambrusco, each particular one showcases a different type of profile to remember. So as a wine student, really understanding that each Lambrusco has its own trademark is something important to remember. So we're going to talk about that now. And when we're thinking about the main Lambrusco grapes, so my personal favorite would be Grappa Rossa, but then there's also Maestri, Salamino, and Sorbara. And so again, just to reiterate, the name came to represent not just grape varieties, but also wine styles made from these varieties. Lambrusco and its eponymous wine have a high profile in the early 21st century. This was largely the result of mass production for major markets in the 1980s, particularly the United States and Northern Europe. So most would remember, especially living in the United States, going to the supermarket or a local wine shop, and Lambrusco was seen as something very sweet and very, maybe inexpensive. It could be $5, $10 a bottle max. And the bottles were usually rather large because they were sold in this type of mass style. What's important to note about Lambrusco as an Italian wine student is that not all Lambrusco would be considered that. So you have to think about all of the producers in the Emilia-Romagna region. The wine itself had gotten that type of, personality, reputation as just something very, very sweet. And then we had producers in Emilia-Romagna who are still trying to let wine drinkers know, hey, this wine, it's not just something sweet that you would serve. It's something that, you could have dry wines as well. So I'm going to talk about that more. So today, most wines bearing the Lambrusco name are made in bulk, and they go through their secondary fermentation in large steel tanks. So this is known as the Martinotti method or Charmat method. And something to keep in mind is that before this, historically, many of Lambrusco wines were made in metodo classico or traditional method, but that was a really complicated process for producers, which is why they're doing it more now with the Martinotti Charmat method. And the popularity of Lambrusco grew so rapidly in the 1980s that it was the only way of producing the required volumes quickly enough. And then, of course, in a cheaper way to keep the wines affordable. So the pigment of Lambrusco grapes creates an alluring ruby red in wines. And when we talk about the specific ones, I'll add some more details. And when allowed to reach full phenolic ripeness, they can result in a wine as intensely perfumed as it is colored. So when we, again, think about the individual members of the Lambrusco wine family, the most important one would probably be Lambrusco di Sorbara. This is the one that's lightest in body and color. So make sure you take that in your notes. And it's also the most floral and fragrant. So sometimes it can be referred to as Lambrusco della Viola due to its intense violet scent with flavors of red currants and strawberries. It ripens earlier and prefers sandy soil and is mainly grown in the province of Modena. So something else to do while you're studying is to have maybe a map of Emilia-Romagna. So Modena is more on the western side in the Emilia part of the region. And the sorbara grape is also important because it needs a pollinator, and that's where Lambrusco Salamino comes in. But this particular version of Lambrusco possesses high acid while being lighter bodied. And the wine styles, again, not all Lambrusco will be sweet. So we can have one that is secco, so a dry, or you can have a dolce, which is sweet. And sometimes this one will really be showcased as a sparkling rosato wine. And if you're going to look for them specifically, you're going to be thinking about Lambrusco di Sorbara, DOC, Modena, DOC, e Reggiano, DOC. So again, we're sticking more towards the Modena part of Emilia-Romagna on the western side, but some of our main producers would be Cavicchioli and Cletocchiari for Lambrusco di Sorbara. Now, as we continue, another Lambrusco would be Lambrusco di Grasparossa, so also known affectionately as Lambrusco di Castelvetro. This particular one is always grown on the higher quality hillsides, again, geographically, between Modena and Bologna. So now we're moving to the south and the east a little bit, and it does best in clay soils. This wine has a distinct color of deep purple, and while not as aromatic, which I can attest to this, I'll talk about that in a moment, it has aromas of almond with flavors of red ripe grapes and dark plum. As a trademark, it will be very creamy with a very thick and rich flesh. And again, not necessarily always dolce. You can find one that is secco or a dry wine, and you can find it in the denominazione origine controllata of Lambrusco Grasparossa di Castelvetro, DOC, and of course our IGT or IGP Emilia. Now, when I think about Lambrusco di Grasparossa, I tend to enjoy the Emilia-Romagna region as a whole. I love traveling to a particular area that is the Castelvetro di Modena area. Beautiful hillsides. When I think of a postcard of Italy, this is what I imagine. There's a particular producer, Opera 02, and has perfect sight of really enjoying that postcard of Emilia-Romagna and walking among the vines of Grasparossa, because you will see, especially in the fall, you'll see the leaves, and it's such a beautiful picture. And something to keep in mind is that Grasparossa, we're sticking to like a really small location in Emilia-Romagna. And that's why with this one, if we're looking for particular producers, you're not going to find that many. But Opera 02 is a perfect example. Venturini Baldini, which is more on the northern part of this, and then Sette Cani. So really make sure to try these different Lambrusco styles, because as a wine student, it will really make sense to why Lambrusco isn't just your typical sweet wine from the 1980s. But as we continue, because we talked about Sorbara and then Grasparossa, my personal favorite, we now think about Lambrusco Salamino. You're probably thinking, is that supposed to sound like salame? Yes, because the reason why is if you think about how the grape looks, it's very abundantly planted, first of all, but it has long cylindrical bunches. So it looks similar to what you were imagining. And it acts as a pollinator for Lambrusco di Sorbara and is considered the best of the Lambruschi wines. It combines the perfume and grace of Sorbara with the structure and power of Grasparossa. It is rather tannic and often blended with Sorbara to give flesh and color. So remember that many of the different Lambrusco grapes are complementary to each other for multiple reasons. So Salamino is very important in this region. If you're looking for a monovarietal, it does exist. So you're looking at the Reggiano DOC, Lambrusco Salamino, or Lambrusco Salamino di Santa Croce DOC, from the producers of Lini and Medici Ermete. But I would be remiss if I did not mention Lambrusco Maestri with its intense purple hue. This is also something to keep in mind, that it is the most deeply colored of the Lambruschi wines. It's gained traction in the past decades as it's hardier and adaptable, and it's usually described as the fruitiest, creamiest, and grapey. Just imagine as a kid when you were thinking about grape bubblegum, this would be the best indicator for a maestri. Of course, a grape bubblegum that is much more sophisticated, but it has flavors of dark plum, ripe black cherries, milk chocolate, and candied violets. And it's usually blended again with Lambrusco Salamino, but gives color to Lambrusco di Sorbara based wines. So it's important as a student to remember that we have certain Lambrusco known for color or for perfume or for its structure, and understanding that they sometimes will be blended together to make that perfect Lambrusco wine. But when we think about Emilia-Romagna, we cannot forget about food. Of course, I mentioned that in Campania, but when we think about Lambrusco wines, the high acidity, soft tannins, and low alcohol content really make it suitable for a wide variety of flavors. It can be served at the beginning of a meal with light appetizers and antipasti platters of olives, marinated vegetables, cured meats, and soft cheeses. And the high acidity makes it even an ideal pairing for rich prosciutto. And because the acid of these wines will cut through the fat of the meat and refresh your palate. But the real star of the show would be Parmigiano Reggiano, aceto di balsamico, tortellini and brodo. I could go on, but think about food and wine pairings. So if it grows with it, it goes with it. Lambrusco is really curtailed to the foods of Emilia-Romagna. If you want to eat well, you, of course, Campania, of course, but Emilia-Romagna is really a very gastronomic powerhouse for Italy. And if you've been there, I assume that you're imagining everything right now that you've eaten there, but really try different types of Lambrusco while really enjoying all the different flavors. That is why I really enjoy going to Emilia-Romagna for this reason, is that I've spent extensive amount of time there. I even actually broke a leg there once and spent time in the hospital. And even the hospital food was amazing because it served the typical dishes of Emilia-Romagna, which was just amazing that even in that setting, I was still able to experience the flavors. So something to keep in mind is that Lambrusco is not just the wine from the 1980s that you might remember or you've heard about. You really need to give it a chance to explore all the different varieties. And you could even pair it with pizza. Think summer's coming up, a chilled bottle with your favorite pizza, and anything with a tomato base would work well. But the only thing that I would say with that is that because of the Lambrusco, if you're dealing with high heat, so something that might have like a chili type of background, the Lambrusco, it might intensify that heat. It might make it more pronounced. If you're into that, that's great. However, you might not be looking for that flavor. But yes, Lambrusco, it's not your grandmother's wine. It's something to really try in 2024 and study.
Are you enjoying this podcast? Don't forget to visit our YouTube channel, Mama Jumbo Shrimp, for fascinating videos covering Stevie Kim and her travels across Italy and beyond, meeting winemakers, eating local food, and taking in the scenery. Now back to the show.
Bentornati. As we continue our grape family discussion, we've talked about Colorino, we've talked about Lambrusco, we've talked about Greco, and now we're talking about Malvasia. This is one where you'll need extensive notes. Just keep that in mind because Malvasia is found throughout the Mediterranean, and it's a family of white wine grapes with an ancient heritage. But there's a plot twist. We'll also talk about some red grapes that have the same name, but many of them are unrelated. This is something to keep in mind. And at least 17 grapes in Italy can attest to the fame of Malvasia, and it was the best known wine from the 14th to 17th centuries thanks to the Venetians, who dominated the Mediterranean Sea and traded Malvasia wines with tremendous success. But what's important to note is that it's very difficult to find a common trait that unites these wines, as this is a family of grapes that produces white and red wines. So this is the most important thing to note. It's better to group them by regions and think about, again, going back to our geography lesson, of locations. So the first one that we'll be talking about is Malvasia Bianca di Candia, and this is the most widely planted Malvasia in Italy, and it's mainly found in Lazio. So if we're thinking about the grape outside of Rome, it is thought that this grape has origins on the Greek island of Crete, as its ancient name in Latin was Candia. It's a very productive variety with vigorous rootstocks, and in human conditions, it's large and thin-skinned berries are more sensitive to disease and more likely to suffer from berry shatter. Most of your examples will be dry and still, and it's very rare to find monovarietal wines made from Malvasia Bianca di Candia. However, if you're going to be looking for the blends, the most important would be Frascati, DOC, Castelli Romani, DOC, Canalino di Frascati, DOCG, which is actually a sweet wine. And this grape can also be found, again, geographically. Some grapes will migrate, so you can also find it in Tuscany, Umbria, and even Le Marche. Moving on to another one would be Malvasia Bianca Lunga. So this claim to fame was because of Bettino Ricasoli's original Chianti recipe. And geographically, we're thinking of Tuscany. And sometimes there it will be noted as Malvasia del Chianti or Malvasia Lunga Toscana. Think about Italian vocabulary. When we're describing the grape itself, the bunches will be long. So that's where the Lunga part is really interesting to remember. And this one is actually closely related to Malvasia Istriana and Malvasia di Lipari, which is the grape. We'll talk about the difference later. And then in the vineyard, as I'd mentioned, large, long bunches and thick-skinned berries, yet variation exists among different clones and biotypes. Always remember that. You change your soil, you change your location, you change your grape. But the main characteristics to remember would be large and long bunches. But if you were to have it in the glass, it will be aromatic with soft acidity and marked salinity, but it will be a contrast to the high acidity that it's usually blended with Trebbiano Toscano to make Vin Santo. And when we're describing the wine itself as a style, of course, a white wine that is still and sweet. So this one is usually used for that Vin Santo, and it can be blended with Sangiovese and Canaiolo Nero in earlier versions of Chianti and Chianti Classico. So that's the history lesson. However, today, mainly used for Vin Santo del Chianti Classico, DOC, and Vin Santo del Chianti, DOC, as a blend with Trebbiano Toscano. Moving on, we also have Malvasia del Lazio. Geographic location. This one is telling you right away we're dealing with Lazio. So before we had talked about the other Malvasia Bianca di Candia, but Malvasia del Lazio, the difference is that this one is considered maybe less desirable because it has very low yields. But in the recent decade, it has been rediscovered as possibly being a higher quality variety. And again, found in Lazio. Note your geography. But it will be referred to also as Malvasia puntinata, which puntinata signifying something that's speckled with dots, because when the berries are ripe, you'll notice the spots. So something also to do while studying is to even maybe look at actual grape pictures. And this one would stand out to you right away. So Malvasia puntinata for its spots, but it's a cross. So between Schiava Grossa and Moscato di Alessandria, which allows it to have an aromatic character. So in the glass, you'll find notes of sage and ripe citrus fruit. And on the palate, it will be very creamy with nuances of beeswax and raisin. And late harvest will allow for the passito versions due to noble rot. So this is why this one's really interesting. If you can try to find it. I actually found one, I think it was about 2 years ago. So in 2022, and it was an enjoyable wine to have. So usually you'll find it as a dry white wine, but if you can find the sweet versions, really do yourself a favor for that. And we're thinking of the type of like the DOPs for this wine would be Frascati, DOC. The sweet one specifically, Canalino di Frascati, DOCG, And then, of course, Castelli Romani, DOC, with some producers, Casale Marchese and Gabriele Magno. Because think about it. If you're visiting Rome, which, of course, most people will start their journey in Rome, if you take a train for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, you will be in the Castelli Romani region and you can really visit producers. Of course, you can have your pasta. So let's talk about that. Because when you're in Rome and you're going out to eat, I always try to tell, friends who ask, for recommendations, stick to wines from where you're visiting so you can really get an idea of the flavors. So the last time I had Malvasia del Lazio, I told you a sweet one, but I've also had a dry one before. And that was while I was having, artichokes. Oh, Roman artichokes. I can just fantasize about them. And it was a really good pairing because the artichokes have a special strong flavor, and this wine was able to complement it very well. So I advise you to get on a plane, go to Rome, get yourself some artichokes, and try a glass of this. And continuing though, because we're going to think about food even more. So going on with Malvasia di Lipari. So again, thinking about geographical location. So Lipari is when we're describing islands that are north of Sicily, so the Aeolian Islands, and most of the majority of these plantings you'll find on the island of Salina. So look on a map. You might have to zoom in because sometimes I find that they're left off the map. They're not as notated, which makes me very sad because, of course, as I had mentioned, my grandfather was from the island of Stromboli. They're very special islands. Sometimes if you were to look at pictures, you might mistake them for Greek islands because of similar architecture, but they really have a character of their own. It's, I would even say, different from Sicily specifically. It's just a more nuanced personality. And of course, we're thinking of these different islands. They were volcanic. Now, Stromboli is a very active volcano in itself. It will erupt, they say sometimes even every hour. I've seen it when I would have been visiting. I will be there again this summer. But think about volcanic islands, even if they were dormant now. And then, of course, active volcanoes. The volcanic soils that exist on all of these Aeolian islands really contribute to this specific Malvasia di Lipari grape because it's important to note that this grape produces one of Italy's best dessert wines, Malvasia delle Lipari. So please note, okay, this is where pesky pronouns come in. If we're talking about the grape, it will be Malvasia di Lipari, D-I. But when it's the wine on the label, you will see delle Lipari, because so delle signifying plural. Because again, when we're dealing with these islands, they're rather small, but grapes can also be combined from the different islands because each island does have its grape growing potential, but maybe not the wine making potential. So you can have a beautiful air-dried passito. I have multiple bottles of this in my home, of course, as an homage to Stromboli and the Aeolian Islands. And these examples are richly honeyed. They're notes of orange and apricot and very light-bodied and fragrant, but not thick and oily. This is something really important to note. Usually when you think of a passito wine, which I adore them all, they're usually very thick and oily. But this one is much lighter, and the orange and apricot notes are perfect for, you guessed it, a cannolo. Okay, so another thing, cannolo is 1, cannoli 2. Well, let's face it, for me, it will be cannoli, or 3, you never know. But this would be a really perfect complement for your Sicilian style dessert. So the next time you find a cannolo when you're visiting Sicily, if you can find a bottle of Malvasia delle Lipari, DOC, you'll be in for a treat. There aren't many producers for this. The two that are the main ones would be Hauner and Florio. And Florio, very synonymous with Marsala wine on the island of Sicily itself, but they're also involved with this special wine. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention other white grapes from the Malvasia family. We have Malvasia Istriana, and that's a dry white wine that comes from current day Croatia. Now, this is where history comes in. So when we think about Istriana, most people will think about that northeastern part of Italy that borders with Croatia. But we have to think about World War II and then, of course, how borders have changed. So when you even think about Sud Tirol, Alto Adige, at one point was with Austria. Now it's with Italy. You go to Alto Adige, it's very important to note that you will also hear German spoken there because of its heritage. But think about Istriana. Many people could have been born in Italy, but then it's current day Croatia. Something that's always important to note when studying Italy is that Italy itself, very young country, and if we think about history, we're going back to city-states and borders that were constantly changing due to different wars and conflicts. So this is a very interesting one to find, but just note that current day Croatia would be attributed to it as well. And then there's another one called Malvasia di Candia Aromatica, and it produces wines that are, think about it, aromatica. It's giving you a hint that they'll be mildly aromatic and it'll have tropical fruits. And this one you'll specifically find in Emilia-Romagna and parts of Lombardy. But I've mentioned all of the different types of white grapes, but Malvasia will surprise you as there are some that are red grapes. That's why we said before, they're not always going to be related and they're not going to share similar characteristics. So when we're thinking of the red-berried Malvasia grapes, the first one is Malvasia Nera di Brindisi. Again, I know we're thinking of geography. So Malvasia Nera di Brindisi. So Brindisi is a city in the region of Puglia. And this grape, it's a natural crossing between Malvasia Bianca Lunga. Okay, so remember the long bunches, and Negro Amaro, a very special grape to Puglian wines. It has a lightly aromatic texture and sandy sites really expose its perfume, early ripening and vigorous. It has unstable anthocyanins, and we know how important anthocyanins are. And the color tends to be pale and oxidizes over time. So for me to even mention that, it will probably give you a hint that this one's not going to be monovarietal most of the time because it's going to have to be blended to actually make a good wine. So it's used as a blending agent for Salice Salentino DOC, Cupertino DOC, and interestingly, Castello di Ama's Chianti Classico Vigna Bella Vista. So this one will also even have a nod in Tuscany, and you're usually looking for blends that have at least 10%, but it will give notes of blackberry and violet. Now, continuing in Puglia, we have another red Malvasia. So this is Malvasia Nera di Lecce, another important city historically, very important to the Greek civilization of this region. Monovarietals will be rare due to unstable anthocyanins again. So we need really good anthocyanins for monovarietal wines. But because of that, it is again used as a blending partner. So with Negro Amaro in Salice Salentino DOC. So it's really interesting that you'll find both of the Malvasia, the reds from this region, as blending agents. But think of your map. Now we're going to go from southeastern Italy, from the heel, all the way closer to the Alps in the western part, closer to France, with Malvasia di Casorzo. Again, I know you're probably tired of hearing me mention the preposition di, but geographically, this is telling us the city of Casorzo, the area, and that's in Piemonte or Piedmont. And this particular red will have a thick skin and rich pulp in geraniol, which is making it very fragrant. Very important when we note grapes that have that. It will become very aromatic, and it's a medium wine with aromas of blackberry and jammy blackcurrant with fresh acidity and tannic mouthfeel. And you will find it mainly listed as Casorzo di Asti, DOC. So if we're thinking about our red Malvasia wines, we're thinking about pairings. At this point, again, I always try to tell people that stick with your region and what grows with it goes with it. So of course, if we were in Puglia, would be different cuisine than Piemonte specifically. Piemonte, maybe with the good vitello. Oof, Now I'm imagining this. I'm getting on a plane as soon as I get off, finish with this. But then in Puglia, I mean, think about, a beautiful piece of focaccia with the tomatoes. But the options are endless because, of course, it's up to you as the taster and, of course, as the listener. If something makes a good combination, then it works for you. That's great. So something to keep in mind as you're studying is to try all of these different grape families, the different wines that we mentioned. Remember geographical location. Remember wine styles can change. They won't necessarily always be the same in the grape families. And just make sure to enhance your palate and really study your Italian wines.
Listen to the Italian Wine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Himalaya FM, and more. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the show. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps cover equipment, production, and publication costs. Until next time, cin cin.